Welcome to A News. I'm Amr Taslim and you're watching Turkey's Diplomacy. As the fighting in Ukraine continues, the United States and European allies are pushing forward with new security guarantees, even though key disagreements over territory remain unresolved. At the same time, Syria is seeing renewed clashes in parts of Aleppo, while contacts between Ankara and Damascus point to closer coordination on security and stability. In Gaza, the ceasefire remains in place, but ongoing strikes and restrictions on aid are keeping the situation fragile. And beyond these conflicts, tensions linked to Yemen, the Red Sea, and Washington's latest moves against Venezuela are adding further pressure to an already crowded global agenda.
Russia said on Thursday that its forces had captured one more settlement in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region, while Ukraine on the same day reported grim situation in the front lines, particularly in the Pokrovsk direction. In its daily combat report, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the Russian troops took control of the Bratska settlement in Ukraine's Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russian forces continued offensive operations across multiple front lines, including Sumy, Kharkiv, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhia, striking on energy and port facilities used by the Ukrainian army, drone assembly and storage sites, and temporary deployment points for Ukrainian troops and foreign mercenaries, the ministry said. Also on Thursday, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, said that the Pokrovsk direction remains the most critical sector of the front lines, with around 50 combat engagements occurring daily. Despite intense pressure, Syrsky emphasized that the Ukrainian forces retained control over areas in northern Pokrovsk. He also warned that the Russian forces were reinforcing their positions with reserve units and actively seeking opportunities to advance further along the front line in Pokrovsk. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said on Thursday that a document on U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine is being prepared for finalization at the highest level. After a conversation with Ukraine's top peace negotiator Rustem Umerov on the results of the peace talks in France, Zelensky said in a post on X that the Ukrainian delegation discussed documents related to recovery and economic development with the U.S. and European partners, as well as the basic framework for ending the conflict. The U.S. side will engage with Russia, and Ukraine expects feedback, he added. The Ukrainian negotiation team on Wednesday held talks with national security advisors from several European countries, White House Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, U.S. President Donald Trump's son-in-law. The discussions focused on ways to end the conflict and provide security guarantees for Ukraine.
Joining me now is Prem Singh Gill. Prem is a fellow at the Royal Asiatic Society in London. Prem, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me back on this new year.
Prem, with the U.S. and Europe now working on these new multi-layered security guarantees for Ukraine, do you think they're actually strong enough to deter Russia from attacking again, especially compared to the Budapest Memorandum, which indeed fell apart?
Let me be blunt. The Paris Declaration signed, which is recently, on January 6th, which represents the most significant commitment to Ukraine's security since the war began. But it fundamentally lacks one thing that actually deter Putin, which automatically a military intervention happened. So here's what that makes the difference by the Budapest and why it might still fail. Budapest was worthless because it was designed to be worthless. In 1994, memorandum was deliberately structured as a political statement rather than a legally binding treaty precisely because the US and the UK refused to commit to military force. So the term Assurances was chosen over guarantees, specifically because guarantees implied a commitment to use military force, which the US government would not be able to provide and which the Senate would never ever ratify. So looking back in the 2026 framework is stronger, but it is still hedged. The coalition of the willing has agreed to provide the political and legally binding guarantees. And that includes a multinational forces, which troops from the France and the UK, the US lead ceasefire monitoring and commitments to support Ukraine militarily, diplomatically and economically in the event of a future Russian attack. But here's the catch. The Paris Declaration does not provide a NATO-style collective security commitments, nor does it clarify whether European forces would defend themselves if attacked by Russia. So here's the elephant in the room. All these security guarantees can only be activated once a ceasefire is agreed, which gives Russia perfect leverage to reject the entire framework by simply refusing to stop fighting.
Prem, we're at this point where, the talks are focusing on security guarantees and possible peace deals. What do you see as the biggest hurdle to finding something that gives Ukraine the solid protection it needs, while also dealing with Russia's demands for neutrality and holding on to the territories that they've seized?
So this is where the diplomacy meets cold reality. The peace talks have exposed unbridgeable chasm. Ukraine's on the red line. Strong security guarantees preservation of the statehood and ultimately European Union or EU and NATO membership pathway. So what actually Russia's actual walk aims is Putin invaded Ukraine to restore it to Moscow's orbit, making it a fundamental conflict, which means that the Trump's peace plan would increase the Kiev's security and ties with the West, which directly contradicts Russia's core objective of returning Ukraine to Russian control. So Putin is actually not fighting for land, but he's actually fighting for Ukraine itself. He views the invasion as a sacred mission to reverse the Soviet collapse and revive the Russian Empire. Any deal leaving 80% of Ukraine beyond Kremlin control and free to pursue European integration is actually unacceptable to him. But looking at the territory remains the thorniest issue in negotiation, with Russia demanding sovereignty over the entire Donbass, while Ukraine and European partner reject rewarding territorial conquests. If fighting continues at the current pace, Russian troops will likely complete the seizure of all the Donbass by the next year. So what it matters, Ukraine faces a nightmare choice: surrender territory now for uncertain guarantees, or fight it or lose it anyway while running out of men, weapons, and Western patience.
Prem, we saw during the presidential campaign that Donald Trump said, "I will end the war in Russia within 24 hours," but that never happened. He also said, "I'll end the war in Gaza." That has never happened. Now that he's back in office and pushing hard for a quicker end to the war as compared to Joe Biden, how do you think his approach is shifting things? Is Trump putting more pressure on Russia, or will he eventually ask Ukraine to make bigger concessions?
Well, the Trump's administration seems to be quite a joke, and his approach is schizophrenic, but simultaneously pressuring both sides while revealing dangerous naivete about Putin's intentions. So the pressure of Ukraine is unmistakable, with Trump downplayed Zelensky's optimism, saying he doesn't have anything until I prove it, which reveals who actually holds leverage in the relationship. Ukrainian analysts, from what I've heard, it has warned, and it's very clear that assigning the inexperienced, politically connected figures like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff to lead complex existential talks has Putin's veteran diplomats a masterful game of delay and distraction, buying Russia crucial time to consolidate territorial gains. But there is no real pressure on Russia. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sanctioned Russia's two largest oil companies, Rosneft, Lukoil, calling it a response to Putin's refusal to end the war. But these are not symbolic measures. Oil and gas export revenues may fall by 25% in 2026, according to the sanctions, or due to the sanctions, and the budget could lose more than 1 trillion rubles. So the cognitive trap here in the warfare, Putin has successfully colonized Trump's mind. And after Putin made exaggerated claims about Russian military advances, Trump repeated a while ago that Ukraine would be better off ceding territory than losing it on the battlefield, and thereby echoing by the Russian narrative that is a victory inevitable. So here's the very brutal assessment that I suggest. Russia has repeatedly said it will not accept deployment of NATO troops to Ukraine as part of any peace deal. Yet it is precisely what the coalition is proposing. But the fundamental contradiction is just that either Trump will abandon European allies or the entire framework collapses.
Prem, this year could definitely bring new negotiations and mediations. But what kind of military, economic, or diplomatic pressures do you think might actually force Russia to become more flexible and willing to compromise?
Looking at this contrarian take, Russia's economy is approaching a genuine crisis that could shift Putin's calculus in this 2026. Economic-wise, it's really tightening. After 2 years of growth exceeding 24%, Russia's GDP for 2025 expected to slow around 1% or even lower, with the same headwinds persisting into 2026. But for the first time since the pandemic, Russia's collected less budget revenue in 2025 than originally it planned, with oil and gas revenues now projected 8.7 trillion rubles, well below the original plan, 10.9 trillion rubles. But here's the perfect storm that comes here in 2026, where the authorities are hiking VAT from 20% to 22%, starting right from the 1st of January, which introducing levies on electronics, sharply increasing the tax burden on small businesses. So while all the military demands show no sign of easing at all, Russia experienced a greater number of human losses in 2025 since the invasion began, and recruitment is becoming increasingly difficult, and regional budgets struggle and payment incentives are cut off. But this is very critical. Putin receives inflated battlefield reports from military officials who exaggerate Ukrainian casualties and downplay Russia's failures, leading him to believe Russia can win through attrition. Even with sanctions, Russia will find loopholes which shells companies will emerge. Intermediaries will appear, and the shadow fleet will continue to operating as long as buyers exist for cheap Russian oil. So the inflection point in 2026, as well as I mentioned, a Russian official stated that a banking or non-payments, you can say, a crisis is possible. And the Russian diplomat chooses to close the Kremlin, will be the critical year economically. But the economic pain alone won't force Putin to negotiate, as he needs to receive and believe as he's losing militarily, not just economically.
Prem, if we're hoping for peace that really lasts, what do you think would be the most important elements that would satisfy Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and the US all at the same time without just setting the stage for another conflict down the road?
In this case, I'd say that there's no sustainable peace formula that satisfies all the parties. But here's the least bad options that could prevent the war in the 5 to 10 years, and the hardship of the framework would be either neither Russia or nor Ukraine gets the Donbass territory they control, a genuine demilitarized zone, patrol our non-NATO forces, possibly China, India, Turkey, with feet to shoot back. What about this? Ukraine gets NATO membership timeline, but not immediate, which Russia won't accept at all. But an clad of 3 to 5 year pathway that cannot be vetoed. This is the only credible deterrent to Russia attacking again. There are massive European boots on the ground. What France could contribute in this case is several thousand troops as part of multinational European forces on Ukrainian territory. Make it of 50,000 to 1,000 European troops, make it so expensive for Russia to restart the war that Putin's successors won't try. And the Marshall Plan 2.0, funded by frozen Russian assets. The European Union agreed with 90 billion euros loan to Ukraine for 2026 to 2027. That would be repaid by Ukraine only once reparations are received, with immobilized Russian assets reserved to repay loan. So the scale to this is approximately 500 billion euros. So having a China as a guarantor but not spectator, what I would reckon Beijing has leverage over Russia through oil purchases. So make the China participation in guarantees not negotiable. That is a catch. So if Russia breaks the deal, China cuts them off. So why this probably won't happen? Putin remains confident he can achieve a decisive breakthrough in 2026, given the Ukrainian manpower shortages and weakening. Western resolve that have a very heavy effect. So Ukraine's position in deteriorating and UK, US pressure is mounting, with tail risk growing both ends. A weakened Ukraine forced to capitulate, or a desperate Ukraine taking bigger gambles that cause further Russian escalation.
Prem Singh Gill, thank you so much for that analysis. It was a pleasure having you on another episode of Turkey's Diplomacy. Thank you so much.